Most players remember Molgera as that easy sandworm boss from Wind Waker, the one you hookshot a few times and move on from without a second thought. But here's the truth that's been hiding in plain sight for over 2 decades. Molgera isn't just another forgettable boss fight, it's one of the most sophisticated teaching tools Nintendo ever designed. This seemingly simple encounter contains layers of genius that most players completely miss, and understanding why changes everything about how we view Wind Waker's design philosophy. Let's address the elephant in the room first. When Zelda fans rank their favorite boss battles, Molgera rarely makes the top 10. Actually, it barely makes the top 20. The common criticism? Too easy, too straightforward, too forgettable. Just hookshot the tongue, slash a few times, repeat until victory. Nothing special, right? This perception has persisted for years, cementing Molgera's reputation as one of Wind Waker's weaker encounters. But what if this reputation is completely wrong? What if the very simplicity that gets criticized is actually the most brilliant aspect of the design? What if Molgera represents a masterclass in elegant game design that modern developers still struggle to replicate? The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker released in 2003 for the GameCube, and from the moment players set foot in the Earth Temple, they knew something felt different. The dungeon's atmosphere is heavy, oppressive, filled with shadows and the ghostly presence of the Sage Medley. Players navigate mirror puzzles, battle undead Stalfos, and eventually descend into the deepest chamber where Molgera waits beneath the sands. That initial encounter creates immediate impact. The arena is massive, a circular pit filled with sand, with several stone pillars rising from the ground at various points. The lighting is dim, atmospheric, creating tension before the boss even appears. And then, the sand begins to ripple. The music shifts. That iconic Molgera theme kicks in with its haunting, otherworldly melody that somehow sounds both beautiful and menacing. The creature that emerges is genuinely impressive. Molgera is huge, a segmented sandworm that dwarfs Link completely. Its grotesque design, with that dangling uvula acting as a weak point, creates an immediate visual target. The boss circles the arena, weaving in and out of the sand with fluid animation that showcases the GameCube's graphical capabilities. For a few seconds, players can only watch as this massive creature establishes dominance over its territory. Now here's where most analyses stop. They see the basic mechanic, hookshot the tongue, attack, repeat, and conclude the fight lacks depth. But this assessment completely misses what makes Molgera special. The genius isn't in mechanical complexity, it's in environmental storytelling, spatial design, and player agency. Let's talk about that arena design, because it's far more sophisticated than it appears at first glance. The sandpit isn't just aesthetic window dressing, it's a core gameplay element that fundamentally changes how players approach combat. Unlike solid ground, where Link moves at full speed, the sand creates resistance. Movement becomes slower, more deliberate, more strategic. Players can't rely on quick dodges or rapid repositioning. Every step requires commitment, every position change needs planning. This environmental friction forces a complete mental shift in how players engage with the encounter. In most Zelda boss fights, players can zip around the arena freely, reacting to threats instantly. Molgera removes that safety net. The sand creates consequence for poor positioning, rewards predictive thinking over reactive play, and demands that players truly understand the boss's patterns rather than simply reacting to them. But the arena design goes even deeper. Notice those stone pillars scattered throughout the space? They're not random decorations, they're strategic vantage points that completely change the fight's dynamics. Players who experiment discover these pillars serve multiple critical functions. First, they provide elevated positions that offer better sightlines across the arena, making it easier to track Molgera's movement through the sand. Second, they create defensive positions where players can temporarily avoid the Molgera larvae that spawn later in the fight. Third, they offer perfect positioning for aerial Deku Leaf attacks. Wait, aerial Deku Leaf attacks? Yes, here's where Molgera transforms from simple hookshot fight into something far more interesting. Most players never discover this because the hookshot method works fine, but the Deku Leaf completely changes the encounter's feel and strategy. The Deku Leaf, that utility item primarily used for gliding between islands, becomes a legitimate offensive weapon against Molgera. When Link uses the Deku Leaf while airborne, it creates a powerful gust of wind that deals damage. Against Molgera, these aerial attacks can hit the creature while it's moving through the sand, creating offensive opportunities that don't exist with the hookshot method. This transforms the fight from reactive, waiting for Molgera to expose its tongue, to proactive, creating damage opportunities through strategic positioning and aerial assault.
But using the Deku Leaf effectively requires mastering multiple interconnected systems. The arena features subtle updrafts rising from specific sand patches. These updrafts aren't marked with obvious visual indicators. Players must notice the slight particle effects and understand their significance. Successfully identifying and utilizing these updrafts allows extended aerial time, which translates to multiple Deku Leaf attacks per jump, which exponentially increases damage output potential. This introduces resource management pressure that doesn't exist in the basic hookshot strategy. The Deku Leaf consumes magic meter, and magic bottles are limited. Players must balance offensive aggression with resource conservation, deciding when to commit to aerial attacks versus saving magic for defensive maneuvers or spawn management. Every Deku Leaf usage becomes a tactical decision with long-term consequences. The game never explicitly teaches this strategy. There's no tutorial pop-up explaining, hey, you can use the Deku Leaf offensively here. No medley dialogue suggesting alternative approaches. No flashing indicator highlighting the updrafts. Nintendo simply created the systems, established the rules, and trusted players to experiment and discover these mechanics organically. This design philosophy reflects Wind Waker's broader approach to player agency and discovery. The game consistently presents multiple valid solutions to challenges, allowing players to develop personal playstyles rather than following prescribed methods. Some players will never discover the Deku Leaf strategy, and that's completely fine. The hookshot method works perfectly well. But players who experiment are rewarded with alternative approaches that feel personally discovered rather than developer-mandated. Now, let's examine Molgera's actual behavior patterns, because they're far more sophisticated than the forgettable reputation suggests. The fight operates in distinct phases, each introducing new complexity that builds on established mechanics. Phase 1 establishes the core loop. Molgera circles the arena beneath the sand, its movement creating visible ripples that players can track. The creature periodically emerges, mouth open, exposing the glowing weak point. This phase teaches pattern recognition. Players learn to predict emergence timing, identify optimal positioning, and execute the hookshot attack sequence efficiently. The phase is deliberately forgiving, allowing players to internalize the basic rhythm without overwhelming pressure. But notice what's happening psychologically. Even in this easy opening phase, Nintendo is training multiple competencies simultaneously. Players develop tracking skills by following the sand ripples. They practice distance judgment to ensure hookshot range. They refine damage optimization by maximizing sword hits before Molgera escapes. They build spatial awareness by maintaining advantageous positioning relative to the boss's movement patterns. All of this learning happens organically through gameplay rather than explicit instruction. Phase 2 escalates complexity by introducing the Molgera larvae, smaller sandworm creatures that emerge to harass Link while the main boss recovers. This isn't just artificial difficulty through enemy spam. The larvae fundamentally change the encounter's strategic calculus. Now players must manage multiple simultaneous threats, prioritize targets based on immediate danger, maintain awareness of both larvae positions and Molgera's location, and decide whether to eliminate larvae or ignore them to focus on the primary target. This multi-threat management tests completely different skills than Phase 1. Players can no longer tunnel vision on Molgera exclusively. They must develop peripheral awareness, track multiple movement patterns simultaneously, and make split-second priority decisions under pressure. The arena design becomes even more important here. Those stone pillars that seemed decorative they're suddenly critical defensive tools for creating separation from larvae swarms. The larvae also serve a brilliant pacing function. They prevent the fight from becoming repetitive by forcing dynamic adaptation. Players can't just memorize a single pattern and execute it robotically. Each phase requires situational assessment. How many larvae are active? Where is Molgera? What's the current magic meter level? Should offensive or defensive tactics take priority? The fight becomes a constant flow of evaluation and adaptation rather than rote pattern execution. Here's something fascinating about Molgera's movement patterns. They're predictable enough to learn, but variable enough to require attention. The boss doesn't follow a rigidly scripted sequence that players can memorize and exploit. Instead, Molgera operates within consistent behavioral rules. It circles at specific speeds, emerges after certain intervals, targets Link's general location, but the exact execution varies each attempt.
This creates a musical quality to the encounter, like jazz improvisation within a structured framework. Players develop an intuitive feel for Molgera's rhythm rather than memorizing exact sequences. This rhythmic understanding creates a satisfying flow state where players aren't thinking analytically about mechanics, but instead responding fluidly to the evolving situation. The fight becomes a dance. Molgera advances, Link retreats. Molgera exposes weakness, Link capitalizes. Larvae swarm, Link creates space. It's dynamic, responsive, alive in a way that rigidly scripted encounters can never achieve. The sound design reinforces this rhythmic quality beautifully. The Molgera theme isn't aggressive or panic-inducing like many boss tracks. Instead, it's melodic, almost hypnotic, with a steady tempo that mirrors the fight's pacing. The music helps players find the encounter's rhythm, unconsciously synchronizing their actions with the audio cues. When Molgera emerges, certain musical phrases accent the action. When larvae spawn, the instrumentation shifts subtly. The entire audiovisual experience works together to guide player behavior without explicit instruction. Let's zoom out and examine what this reveals about Nintendo's design philosophy. Molgera represents a specific approach to challenge design that prioritizes elegance over complexity. Modern game design often equates difficulty with mechanical density, more attacks to dodge, more patterns to memorize, more systems to manage. Molgera takes the opposite approach, a few core mechanics executed with spatial sophistication and environmental integration. This philosophy trusts player intelligence in a way many modern games don't. Nintendo doesn't feel the need to constantly introduce new mechanics or gimmicks to maintain engagement. Instead, they create a simple, clear system and allow depth to emerge from how that system interacts with environmental design, enemy behavior, and player experimentation. The complexity is systemic rather than mechanical. It emerges from interactions between simple components rather than being artificially imposed through feature bloat. Think about what this means for accessibility and mastery depth. A new player can grasp Molgera's basics immediately. Hookshot the tongue, attack with sword, avoid larvae. The core loop is intuitive enough that anyone can complete the fight with patience. But a skilled player can discover optimization strategies, Deku Leaf aerial combos, perfect larvae management, optimal positioning for maximum damage uptime. The same encounter serves both audiences simultaneously without compromise. This scalable difficulty through emergent complexity is brilliant game design. The fight never feels artificially constrained for accessibility or bloated for hardcore players. It simply presents clear rules and allows each player to engage at their own skill level. Casual players get a satisfying, achievable challenge. Hardcore players get room for mastery and optimization. Everyone experiences a well-designed encounter tailored to their capabilities. Molgera also demonstrates Nintendo's understanding of pacing within the larger Wind Waker experience. The Earth Temple is the game's third major dungeon, arriving after players have spent significant time mastering basic mechanics. The preceding bosses, Goma and Kali Demos, established core combat competencies and hookshot fundamentals. Molgera builds on that foundation while introducing spatial complexity and multi-threat management. The fight serves as a skill check, verifying that players have internalized Wind Waker's movement systems and combat fundamentals before progression continues. But it never feels punitive or gatekeeping. The difficulty curve is gentle enough that struggling players can overcome the challenge with practice, while skilled players breeze through without feeling patronized. It's a perfect example of balanced difficulty that respects player time and capability. Consider how Molgera fits into Wind Waker's broader thematic framework. The game emphasizes exploration, discovery, and player-driven experience over prescribed paths and rigid structure. Molgera embodies this philosophy perfectly. Players who rush through using the obvious hookshot strategy have a fine experience. Players who experiment with Deku Leaf tactics discover hidden depth. Players who master the fight's rhythm achieve flow state satisfaction. Each playstyle is valid, each approach is supported, and no single correct method exists. This approach to design creates personal investment in victories. When players beat Molgera, they're not just executing a solution someone else designed, they're demonstrating mastery of systems they learned to manipulate through personal discovery. That sense of ownership, of having figured something out rather than being told how it works, creates much deeper satisfaction than guided experience ever could.
The environmental storytelling deserves special attention too. The Earth Temple's atmosphere, dark, oppressive, filled with the weight of ancient history, creates perfect thematic context for Molgera. This isn't just a random monster, it's a guardian that's protected this sacred space for centuries, possibly millennia. The creature's alien design, with its segmented body and grotesque weak point, suggests something ancient and otherworldly rather than a simple animal. The arena itself tells a story without words. Why is there a massive sand pit at the Earth Temple's deepest point? What purpose did this space originally serve? The scattered pillars suggest this was once a constructed chamber, now partially buried by time and erosion. Molgera didn't create this space, it inhabits it, suggesting the creature is as much a prisoner as a guardian, trapped in this underground lair for ages unknown. These environmental details don't affect gameplay directly, but they create atmospheric richness that elevates the encounter beyond pure mechanics. Players aren't just fighting a boss, they're disturbing something ancient, confronting a guardian in its domain, violating a sacred space that hasn't been entered in centuries. That narrative context makes the victory feel more significant than simply checking a box on a progress list. Now, let's address the easy criticism directly. Yes, compared to bosses like Breath of the Wild's Thunderblight Ganon or Twilight Princess's Stallard, Molgera isn't mechanically demanding, but equating easy with bad design fundamentally misunderstands what makes encounters memorable. Difficulty is just one axis of evaluation, and often not the most important one. Molgera succeeds at creating a specific type of experience, an atmospheric, rhythmic encounter that teaches spatial awareness and multi-threat management without overwhelming players. That's a legitimate and valuable design goal. Not every boss needs to be a brutal skill check. Sometimes the goal is teaching, sometimes it's atmosphere, sometimes it's pacing variation. Molgera accomplishes its design goals beautifully, and judging it for not being something it never tried to be is missing the point entirely. Consider the player emotional journey through Molgera. The initial intimidation as this massive creature emerges, the satisfaction of landing that first successful hookshot, the mild panic when suddenly larvae swarm, the growing confidence as patterns become clear, the rush of executing a perfect sequence, the triumph of final victory. That's a complete emotional arc compressed into a 5-minute encounter. The fact that the mechanics aren't brutally difficult doesn't diminish the satisfaction of the experience. Actually, Molgera's accessibility might be its greatest strength. Because the fight isn't crushing, players can appreciate the design's sophistication without frustration clouding their perception. They notice the visual cues, appreciate the arena design, experiment with alternative strategies, all things that become impossible when a fight is so difficult that players tunnel vision on survival. Molgera's measured difficulty allows its other qualities to shine rather than being obscured by challenge. Let's examine the lasting impact of Molgera's design philosophy on subsequent Zelda titles. The emphasis on environmental integration and systemic complexity over mechanical density becomes a core principle in later games. Breath of the Wild's approach to combat, simple button inputs creating complex outcomes through physics interactions and environmental exploitation, is a direct evolution of ideas Molgera explored 20 years earlier. Tears of the Kingdom takes this even further. The game's most memorable encounters aren't necessarily the hardest. They're the ones where environmental creativity and systemic interaction create unique moments. The flux construct battles succeed not because they're mechanically complex, but because they encourage creative problem-solving using the game's core systems. That's pure Molgera philosophy applied to modern open-world design. Even the recent Echoes of Wisdom incorporates these principles. The game's ecosystem creates depth through systemic interactions rather than mechanical complexity. Players discover countless creative solutions to challenges, just like discovering the Deku Leaf strategy against Molgera. Clearly, Nintendo learned from Wind Waker's successes that elegant systemic design often creates more satisfying gameplay than mechanical bloat. The Molgera encounter also influenced how Nintendo thinks about boss pacing and variety. Not every major encounter needs to be an endurance test or a technical showcase. Sometimes a mid-difficulty, atmosphere-focused fight provides necessary pacing variation and serves crucial teaching functions. This understanding creates more diverse, interesting boss rosters where each encounter has distinct character and purpose. Think about the community discussion around Molgera over the years. Despite the forgettable reputation, the fight generates genuine affection among Wind Waker fans. People remember the haunting music, the striking visual design, the satisfaction of that first successful hookshot.
The encounter has staying power, not through mechanical complexity, but through atmospheric cohesion and design elegance. That's a testament to the sophistication of Nintendo's approach. Modern game design discourse often fixates on mechanical complexity as the primary measure of quality. More systems, more inputs, more options, these are treated as inherently better. Molgera challenges this assumption by demonstrating that elegant simplicity can create equally memorable, satisfying experiences when executed with spatial intelligence and environmental integration. This isn't nostalgia speaking either. Players experiencing Wind Waker for the first time today still appreciate Molgera's qualities. The design principles that make the fight work, clear visual communication, spatial awareness challenges, rhythmic pacing, atmospheric cohesion, are timeless. They don't depend on contemporary gaming conventions or dated mechanics. Good design transcends its era, and Molgera remains a masterclass in elegant encounter design 20 years after release. So, what can modern developers learn from Molgera? First, that simplicity isn't a weakness when executed thoughtfully. A few well-designed mechanics can create more depth than a dozen half-baked systems. Second, that environmental integration elevates encounters beyond pure combat mechanics. The sand, the pillars, the updrafts, these environmental elements create strategic complexity without mechanical bloat. Third, that player discovery should be encouraged rather than prescribed. The Deku Leaf strategy exists for players who seek it, but never feels mandatory or artificially gated. Perhaps most importantly, Molgera teaches that not every encounter needs to be a brutal challenge to be worthwhile. The fight serves its purpose beautifully, teaching spatial awareness, introducing multi-threat management, providing atmospheric variety, and creating satisfying rhythm. Those are legitimate, valuable design goals that deserve recognition even if the encounter isn't mechanically demanding. The next time someone dismisses Molgera as forgettable or too easy, challenge that assessment. Ask them to consider the spatial design, the environmental integration, the multiple valid strategies, the atmospheric cohesion, and the elegant teaching methodology. Complexity isn't always mechanical. Sometimes it's environmental, sometimes it's systemic, and sometimes it emerges from the interaction between simple components. Wind Waker's Molgera represents a specific design philosophy that modern gaming increasingly ignores, the philosophy that elegant simplicity, when executed with intelligence and care, creates experiences just as memorable as mechanically complex alternatives.
The fight isn't trying to be Dark Souls. It's not attempting to create the next iconic challenge that speedrunners will optimize for decades. It's simply trying to be a well-designed, atmospheric, spatially interesting encounter that teaches important skills while providing satisfying rhythm. And by that measure, Molgera succeeds absolutely. The fact that this success gets overlooked because the encounter isn't brutally difficult says more about modern gaming discourse than it does about Molgera's quality. Sometimes the most sophisticated design is the design that disappears, that feels so natural and intuitive that players don't consciously recognize the craft behind it. That's the ultimate compliment to Nintendo's work on Molgera. The encounter feels so right, so natural, so perfectly calibrated that players experience it without analyzing why it works. Only upon reflection, upon deliberate examination, does the sophistication become apparent. That invisible elegance, that seamless execution that makes complex design feel simple and intuitive, that's the real masterclass. So, the next time Wind Waker comes up in discussion, give Molgera its due recognition. This isn't just another forgettable boss fight. It's a perfect example of Nintendo's design philosophy at its finest. Elegant, intelligent, spatially sophisticated, and trusting of player capability. The fight might not top any difficulty rankings, but it absolutely deserves recognition as an overlooked masterclass in thoughtful game design. What other supposedly easy or forgettable Zelda bosses deserve reconsideration? Which encounters have sophisticated design hiding beneath surface simplicity? The conversation continues because great game design rewards analysis even decades after release.